Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 14. William Pitt the Younger. A revolutionary young man? Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. This is one of the most difficult ones we've done so far. William Pitt the Younger is very difficult to summarise, but we'll give it a go in this episode. He's one of the most famous of the early Prime Ministers, and with almost 20 years in the job, he certainly must have been superlative, but in this episode we'll examine how. Now for any newcomers to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, welcome. Here we like to literally pick a Prime Minister at random every week and then ask a few questions such as what were they like, how did they get into office, and how did they leave office. In the meantime, what were their greatest achievements? And along the way we like to paint a little picture of the time. Now if you do like the sound of that, don't forget we've already covered many Prime Ministers here on Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, so they'll be available on your podcast provider or on longhistory.net, our website. Having said that, if this is your first episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, you've picked a good one, so keep listening. So let's get going with Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 14, William Pitt the Younger. A revolutionary young man? Pitt the Younger was the 14th Prime Minister, and of those first 14 men to take up the post, there were many colourful characters, but surprisingly few names stand out. Not many of them are widely remembered today. Pitt the Younger was the last of the 18th century Prime Ministers, and his name does stand out if only for its quirkiness. Who was Pitt, and why was he the younger? What is it about this Premier that makes him, amongst all those men forgotten by most people, someone whose name could at least ring a bell today? Well, the numbers speak for themselves actually. At just shy of 19 years in office, Pitt the Younger is far and away one of the longest serving Prime Ministers ever, second only to Robert Walpole. But Robert Walpole himself was something of an exception, being the first Prime Minister, the one who defined the role right at the beginning. Pitt the Younger, however, was the youngest ever man to become Prime Minister, far and away. At the extraordinary age of 24. How on earth did that happen? The second oldest was the relatively ancient Augustus Fitzroy, the Duke of Grafton, a 33-year-old. He was back in the 1760s, however. In modern times, one of our most recent Prime Ministers, Rishi Sunak, was noticeably young when he started the job, but even he was a relatively decrepit 42-year-old when he was handed the job. What circumstances led to Pitt the Younger getting the job at such a young age? We'll find out here. But the superlative numbers don't end there. For the only reason that Pitt the Younger's time as Prime Minister wasn't longer was due to his ill health and eventual death in office at the age of 46. So that also makes him the second youngest Prime Minister at the time of death, with only William Cavendish, the 4th Duke of Devonshire, who was briefly Prime Minister in the 1750s, dying younger. He was 44. It can actually be argued, therefore, that Pitt the Younger died due to being Prime Minister, having spent pretty much all of his adult life in the job. All in all, the proportion of his life spent running the country is extraordinary and pretty impossible to beat, comparing only with monarchs rather than other Prime Ministers. There are a lot of good reasons for this strange set of circumstances that meant Pitt the Younger was in the job so long. He was clearly good at his job, but what being a good Prime Minister in the 18th century context is interesting, and there are not so good reasons why he stayed in the job so long, reminding us that this was an age when the phrase, "it's not what you know, it's who you know," was most important of all. Pitt the Younger was the son of a much praised Prime Minister and war leader, Pitt the Elder. Yes, his father was also Prime Minister, and there is a sense that at this period in history, the 1780s, people wanted a sequel, a Pitt the Elder 2, as it were. So when the son actually turned out to be talented, the right people got just what they wanted. Pitt the Younger in turn shared a talent with that other long-lasting Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, of keeping the right people happy. not least the monarch of the time, George III in this case, and the notion of sailing a steady ship through turbulent waters will come up 1 or 2 times in this episode. That appears to have been Pitt the Younger's main talent. The subtitle of this episode is A Revolutionary Young Man, but there's a question mark at the end of it, because, as we'll see, it's not so much that he was revolutionary, but that he was a good Prime Minister at a time of revolutions. As we head into this episode, therefore, there are already lots of questions. This is clearly one of the most superlative Prime Ministers ever, in many ways. But why is he not therefore a national hero, an early Winston Churchill, for example? The numbers suggest he should at least be on our money, and celebrated by every child at school, but why is he not? Well, we can always argue that a general lack of interest in history is one answer, but there are others, possibly, and we'll propose them here. What was Pitt the Younger like? Apparently he was very good at remembering things from an early age, and he was particularly good in debates. He responded spontaneously to arguments very well, always apparently coming up with the right words. He grew up with politics in his blood, and it made him an expert in the field. He was young in chronological age when he started the job, but it is also said that he was young in appearance. This wasn't some preternaturally mature man. He has been described as tall and thin and even slightly gangly, and he had a self-confidence. We'll explain the reason why for that a bit later, but it meant he knew how to hold his own in Parliament from the start, keeping a cool head in heated debates. And that coolness is a description that's often repeated about Pitt the Younger. He doesn't appear to have been a friendly man, for example, but rather was slightly detached, self-confident and self-contained. He never married, which has led to the usual rumours about these bachelor premiers, including those hints of a tragic early lost love, and the rumours that he might have been gay. Anything's possible because there was no proof either way, but these were sadly closeted times, and Pitt the Younger wasn't the only of these bachelor premiers to appear to dedicate his whole life to politics to the exclusion of any romantic life. What was the historical background? The final departure of the 13 colonies to form the United States happened just before Pitt began his tenure. As Pitt took up office, it became even more clear that the Irish didn't like their parliament being subsidiary to the English parliament, and did like the look of that new United States. The English attempted to solve these increasing calls for independence by making it less independent, leading to the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1801, a whole new definition of the country spearheaded by Pitt. Controversy surrounding the new makeup of the UK, however, would lead to the end of Pitt's first premiership, as we'll see. The French Revolution began just 5 years into Pitt's time in office in May 1789. This led to a series of wars called the French Revolutionary Wars, involving European monarchies striking back against the French Republic and against the spread of this French Revolution. This would eventually lead to the Napoleonic Wars, which led to Pitt returning to the premiership for his second brief time in office. The United Kingdom at the time. Well, as we've said, the very country's name meant something different at the beginning of Pitt's tenure than it did at the end. Just 2 decades before Pitt took up office, there'd been a series of rotating prime ministers who were increasingly reluctant to do the job, including that Pitt the Elder, Pitt the Younger's father, who was a much more committed war leader than a prime minister. After this messy 1760s, the 1770s came with the loss of those 13 colonies, and then in the early 1780s, another 3 premierships in quick succession destabilised the country once again as the reality of this loss of the colonies took hold. With all this confusion, the French Revolution just around the corner, perhaps the country and the king, who still held much of the real power in those days, was happy just to find someone who was willing to take up the job, and who proved to be quite good at it, and who stayed around for a while. What was happening over the Atlantic in the US at the time? Of course, these were the formative years of the United States. Although the 13 colonies had become states in July 1776, it was during Pitt's time in office that they all ratified the Articles of Confederation, the first constitution of the new country. By the end of Pitt's second period in office, 17 states in total had joined the Union, the last ones being Tennessee in 1796 and Ohio in 1803. Pitt's time in office in the meantime coincided with the tenures of 3 presidents: George Washington, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Who could vote when Pitt the Younger was Premier? Well, we ask this question in each episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week in order to look at the evolution of democracy in the United Kingdom. And in terms of democracy, these were very strange times. The United States had left before Pitt began his tenure, and the French Revolution, as we said, began just 5 years into his time in office. People were clamouring for more of a say in the running of their countries. What was the British response? Well, it wouldn't be until 1832, many years after Pitt's premiership, that any reforms would take place, and during this time the UK would have a revolution of its own, albeit the Industrial Revolution. As such, until 1832, only aristocrats and the landed gentry had any say in running the country. With the country's nearest neighbours, France, and its nearest relatives in the United States, all clamouring for their own democracies, this was very much a live issue at the time. What was Pitt the Younger's background? He was apparently very close to his father, Pitt the Elder, who led the country through the 7 Years' War. He set a very specific path for his son by insisting that he be homeschooled. Pitt the Elder had gone to Eton, and this is the establishment's favourite place for future prime ministers, but Pitt the Elder had disliked it so much, he refused to let his son be browbeaten by an education system in the same way. This tactic seemed to succeed, allowing for Pitt the Younger's intelligence and his interests to flourish without having to deal with pesky peers, making fun of what we could call his swottishness. This seems to have fostered an independent spirit in Pitt the Younger, which stood him in good stead over the years. This particular education seemed to be a bit of a political hothouse for the young Pitt, being, by default, brought up surrounded by his father's political peers. A key detail of Pitt the Younger's life was that he was actually the second son, and as such he wouldn't inherit his father's title. This meant that he wouldn't sit in the House of Lords with other men who inherited their titles, but instead would be able to sit in the House of Commons, and therefore closer to power. After being home-educated by tutors, he went to Cambridge University, and it was during his teens that, due to his poor health, he was advised to take port, which he would do throughout his life to the detriment of his health and quite possibly contributing to his early death. He liked to drink. With this background, a famous father, spending his whole life around politicians, and a very good ability to remember things, to argue his case, and to use his intellect to win the day, it was inevitable that Pitt would follow in his father's footsteps. When a child follows a parent, it can sometimes serve to confirm the talents of the parent and the shortcomings of the child. Sometimes, however, the child proves very much to be the offspring of the parent. Such was the case with Pitt the Younger when he entered Parliament at the age of 21. He made a speech which apparently was so good that it shocked the people who listened to it. The politician's son took to Parliament like the proverbial duck to water, immediately, it seems, asserting himself according to the sources. It's hard to know how much this has been exaggerated over the years. All the sources do seem to agree that he was exceptional. How did Pitt the Younger become Prime Minister? Between March 1782 and December 1783, there were 3 Prime Ministers in quick succession. As we've said, it looked like the country was going to return to another unstable period like the 1760s had been, when there were 6 or 7 Prime Ministers in quick succession. And this was then followed by the calamity of the loss of the 13 colonies. Pitt's great rival during his whole political life was Charles Fox, and he was the only serious contender for the role at this time. Yet there was one significant stumbling block for Fox. George III hated him. When William Petty, the Earl of Shelburne, took office, Fox didn't support the new Premier. Pitt, however, shrewdly did, and this was when he became the Chancellor of the Exchequer. There was briefly a tit-for-tat in government when Petty resigned his job after only 7 months in the role because of the people who opposed his premiership. That grouping put together enough supporters to put William Cavendish Bentinck, the Duke of Portland, in the top job. However, this grouping was partly led by Fox, and so it didn't last long because the king didn't support him. During this period, Pitt, again shrewdly, didn't align himself with this grouping, and so was chosen as the next Prime Minister by the king. It was a controversial moment in politics, but others soon came on side, not least because of the king's continued firm backing for Pitt the Younger. In the wider country, apparently, Pitt the Younger was also seen as a welcome leap to a new generation, untainted by the recent disasters. What were Pitt the Younger's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? This is always the most difficult section of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, because some Prime Ministers quite simply didn't have any achievements. And other Prime Ministers, although they do have many achievements, don't have one standout one. And Pitt, I think, fits into this camp because his biggest achievement just seems to have been the one that's already been mentioned. He stayed in office for an extraordinarily long time. This was, of course, a great achievement, but rather than being because he was the greatest patriotic inspiration ever, it seems to have been because, again like Robert Walpole, he was just very good at keeping the ship of state steady. He was good at making sure the country's finances were in good shape, and this wasn't an easy task, especially after the loss of the 13 colonies. During Pitt the Younger's tenure, in the meantime, George III had his period of madness, and Pitt navigated this crisis to his advantage. The king recovering before that political rival, Fox, managed to manoeuvre him out of office. During Pitt the Younger's time in office, the British Empire was expanding, and this meant there was a lot to deal with. For example, the division of Canada between the British and the French, which was an ongoing issue during those years. Pitt's ability to maintain stability had arguably its downsides. Pitt the Younger fully backed the monarchy during times of the French Revolution. He increased the state's power, not least by creating a network of spies encouraged to denounce any revolutionary radicals in the country. These were tense times in a country whose neighbour had just evicted, rather brutally, its own monarchy, and so Pitt's full backing of the status quo goes some way to explaining his longevity in office. The one consistent mark against him amongst the sources seems to have been that he wasn't actually a very good war leader. That's not to say he was terrible, but the British did not fare well in the earliest battles of the French Revolutionary Wars, and there was a genuine fear that Britain could be invaded during those times. It's noticeable that the greater war leaders, the Churchills, the Lloyd Georges, weren't actually in office at the beginning of the wars they're famous for. Palmerston also came into office as the Crimean War was already raging, so all three of these men were around at the conclusion of their wars, and to varying extents, could take credit for the end of those wars. The same, however, can't be said of Pitt. The French Revolutionary Wars, only coming to some sort of stalled peace when Henry Addington took office as Prime Minister, and then the Napoleonic Wars starting up and continuing long after Pitt the Younger's death. So I think it's fairly safe to say that if Pitt the Younger had been around at the end of those wars, not least like his father actually at the end of the 7 Years' War, his reputation, already high, would have been much higher. Why did Pitt the Younger stop being Prime Minister? In 1801, to solve one of the many ongoing issues of the time, Pitt pushed through the Act that would redefine the relationship between Ireland and the rest of the UK. As a result, on January 1st, 1801, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was birthed. It was an attempt to solve the Irish issue, but one of Pitt's main aims with this union was thwarted by the king. Pitt wanted Catholic emancipation, that is, for Catholics to be treated on the same terms as Protestants. However, the King, George III, saw the protection of Protestantism as his very raison d'etre, so he would not even broach the subject. As a result of this difference of opinions, Pitt resigned, so interestingly he didn't actually leave the job due to lack of popularity. He was replaced by the man we've just mentioned, Henry Addington, who was actually his own family doctor's son. However, even he seems to have thought he wasn't a leader in the same mould as the more experienced Pitt the Younger. When the Revolutionary Wars erupted once again, this time evolving into the Napoleonic Wars proper, it was felt that a more experienced politician and war leader was needed. Addington apparently willingly gave his premiership back to the much more popular Pitt the Younger. Pitt returned to the job, but by this time his health was failing. He served for almost another 18 months, but by this time the stresses of the job led to him dying in office at the age of only 46. Why should we remember Pitt the Younger? Well, as we've stated, it's as a war leader that the title of Best Prime Minister Ever is won and lost. We've mentioned 3 winners, Lloyd George, Churchill and Palmerston, but Margaret Thatcher also increased her popularity thanks to a war. In the meantime, look to Frederick North, Tony Blair and Anthony Eden to see what happens when international conflicts go awry. Pitt the Younger sits in the muddy middle of these extremes perhaps, so he can't claim the ultimate patriotic prize in that regard. This is perhaps the biggest reason why, although still rated very highly in many lists, he doesn't stand out enough to make it on the coins and notes. His longevity guarantees his continued fame, not least because he was in power during a huge period of growth, thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the burgeoning empire. The UK was only a proto-democracy during Pitt's time in office, and really this is another strike against him. He didn't so much win the premiership as ascend to it, because of his father, because of his acquaintances, and although he was clearly talented, it was talent, shall we say, compared to his peers. And with the bunch of entitled aristocrats who'd been gifted the premiership during the previous decades, well, anyone who showed a modicum of talent for the job would have shone very brightly amongst that lot. That he stayed in the job so long is testament to his ability to keep the ship sailing smoothly through admittedly turbulent times. But in those days, more than ever, that involved keeping those in power, and keeping all those with money. If you're not a war leader, it helps if you're a reformer, not just an administrator. See William Gladstone, Herbert Asquith, Earl Grey, Robert Peel and Clem Attlee. We've already done episodes on all these prime ministers. Pitt's expertise was with the country's finances. He seems to have excelled in his role as Chancellor of the Exchequer, but being a good accountant isn't the most glamorous way to seal your reputation. He did apparently make some attempts to reform the sclerotic voting system, not least by trying to reduce the number of rotten boroughs. But he failed in his attempts. His creation of this new country, the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, was well-intentioned, but it didn't solve the Irish issue. On the other hand, the subheading of this episode was A Revolutionary Young Man with a question mark after it. And in some sense, it can be argued that Pitt was the right man to lead the country during times of revolution, industrial, French and otherwise. As the rest of Europe tore itself apart, the stability that Pitt gave the country gave its leaders advantages in the years to come, setting the groundwork for what's been known as the UK's imperial century. But the result of that was that the people would have to wait some time before they could participate in the politics of the country whose industrial revolution they were driving. Thank you everyone for making it to this point of the latest episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. This was a particularly difficult episode to put together. Pitt the Younger was almost impossible to summarise, hence I think this is the longest episode we've ever created. As always, there are many opinions available here about the history of Ireland, about voting rights in the UK, about the British Empire, and the beginning of that imperial century, and what that actually meant. As always though, I just see this as a starting point so you can begin your own research if you're interested. Thank you for listening though. If you've enjoyed that episode, as always, please do give it a like and share it with anyone who might be interested. Your help would be much appreciated there. Thank you for listening, everyone, to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 14, William Pitt the Younger, a revolutionary young man. Goodbye.